I was standing in a Phoenix hotel room at 6:12 in the morning, preparing for a career-defining presentation, when my phone buzzed. An email from my mother casually explained she and my sister had taken my $500,000 in savings and flown to Hawaii. I did not scream. I track hidden financial footprints for a living. My family had just chosen the absolute worst person to betray. My name is Reese Carter. I am 35 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life building a fortress out of numbers, logic, and relentless discipline. On the morning my family decided to tear that fortress down, the world around me was aggressively, almost insultingly normal. I was standing in the center of a sprawling, overly air-conditioned suite at a luxury corporate hotel in Phoenix, Arizona. The dry, unforgiving desert heat outside was kept at bay by thick, tinted glass windows, leaving the air inside the room feeling practically refrigerated. I stood near the edge of a heavy mahogany desk, nursing a cup of black coffee that had been slowly cooling for the past 20 minutes. I was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. My black leather heels clicked with sharp, rhythmic precision against the polished stone floor of the entryway as I paced, running through the morning agenda in my head. I was in Phoenix representing my firm, Blackridge Recovery Partners. My objective for the day was massive and uncompromising. I was scheduled to present the final, devastating results of a complex contract fraud investigation to the executive board of directors of a major private medical logistics corporation. The schedule laid out before me was brutal. I had back-to-back meetings starting precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, followed by a grilling session with their legal team, and ending with a strategy phase to claw back millions in embezzled corporate funds. I felt the familiar, low-level hum of professional adrenaline coursing through my veins. Everything was exactly in its proper place. Every ledger had been meticulously scrutinized. Every hidden corporate asset had been dragged kicking and screaming into the harsh light of day. I thrive in this high-pressure environment because numbers never lie, even when the people who manipulate them do. The absolute silence of my hotel suite was broken at exactly 12 minutes past 6 in the morning. A short, sharp vibration echoed from the glass side table where I had rested my phone. The screen lit up, casting a faint, pale blue glow against the dim morning lighting of the room. I almost ignored it entirely. At that specific hour, a notification is usually nothing more than an automated security alert from a bank or a mundane flight delay text from a commercial airline. I took a slow, measured sip of my lukewarm coffee, set the white porcelain cup down on a leather coaster, and picked up the device. The sender name displayed on the lock screen made my thumb hover motionless over the glass. Pamela Carter, my mother. We did not have the kind of warm, communicative relationship that warranted early morning messages. The subject line of the email was displayed in bold, unassuming black text. Do not chase us. Be happy for us. I felt a mild, predictable flicker of annoyance in my chest. I assumed it was just another dramatic, blown out of proportion complaint about the electric bill back home, a passive-aggressive rant about how my travel schedule neglected them, or some petty grievance regarding the maintenance of the house in Charlotte. My mother possessed a truly unique, exhausting talent for turning minor daily inconveniences into tragedies of epic proportions. I swiped the screen to unlock the phone and open the message, fully expecting to quickly scan the rambling text, roll my eyes, and archive it before walking down to the hotel lobby. Instead, I found myself staring blindly at 3 agonizingly short, meticulously cruel paragraphs that would permanently sever the bloodline between us. The words were written with a casual, chilling detachment that practically bled through the digital screen. Pamela did not begin with a standard greeting. She offered no apologies. She simply stated that she and my younger sister, Blair Carter, had finally decided to take the share of the family resources that they felt they had always deserved. The text was clinically precise. My mother explained, in a tone that sounded like she was discussing the weather, that they had packed up all the valuables in my home. They had cleared out the antiques, the heirloom jewelry, the expensive art, anything that could be liquidated quickly and quietly. She then wrote that they had successfully transferred my entire life savings, a sum totaling roughly $500,000 out of my primary financial accounts. They were not writing to negotiate. They were writing to gloat. According to the email, they were currently sitting comfortably in a first-class airport lounge, waiting to board a direct flight to Oahu, Hawaii. They were going to start the beautiful, carefree life they believed they were meant to live, entirely free from the oppressive, working-class atmosphere I had apparently forced upon them. I read the words again, my eyes scanning the glowing letters. $500,000. $500,000 of my blood, my sweat, my endless 60-hour work weeks, my sacrificed weekends, all evaporated into the tropical retirement fantasies of two grown women who had never worked a genuinely hard day in their entire lives. But it was the final sentence of the email that was explicitly designed to completely break my spirit. My mother had carefully, deliberately chosen her parting shot to inflict maximum psychological damage. She wrote that I should not bother trying to find them, and that I should not try to force them to come back, because I was always better suited to being alone than living as a family anyway. It was a vicious, calculated insult. It was meant to make me feel incredibly small, profoundly isolated, and entirely responsible for their ultimate betrayal. They wanted me to believe that my dedication to my career made me cold, and that my coldness justified their theft. A normal person would have dropped the phone in shock. A normal, loving daughter would have collapsed onto the expensive stone floor of that hotel room, sobbing uncontrollably, gasping for air as the crushing gravity of a $500,000 betrayal crashed down upon her shoulders. She would have screamed at the blank walls, called the police department in a blind, hyperventilating panic, or desperately dialed her mother's phone number over and over again to beg for a logical explanation. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not scream. I did not shed a single, solitary tear. I just stood there in the chilling, unnatural silence of the suite. I felt a profound, terrifying stillness wash over my entire body, starting from the base of my neck and spreading down to my fingertips. It was not the freezing paralysis of unexpected shock. It was the absolute, crystalline clarity of a woman who had secretly, quietly suspected this exact catastrophic scenario was coming for a very, very long time. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep, intentional breath, letting the icy, conditioned air fill my lungs completely. The phantom weight of my mother and sister, an exhausting, parasitic burden I had carried on my back for years, suddenly felt very different in my mind. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating moral obligation. It was a brightly painted target. I opened my eyes. The hotel room looked exactly the same, but the architecture of my reality had permanently shifted. I did not text them back to argue. I did not call them to hurl insults. With deliberate, highly measured movements, I tapped the screen of my phone and forwarded the entire damning email directly to my personal attorney. I did not add any frantic commentary. The evidence spoke for itself. I pressed the side button and locked the screen of my phone, slipping it into the inner pocket of my suit. I walked over to the desk, picked up my heavy leather portfolio containing the corporate investigation reports, and smoothed out the imperceptible wrinkles in my charcoal jacket. I turned around, opened the heavy wooden door of my suite, and walked out into the brightly lit hallway. As I stepped into the waiting elevator and pressed the polished silver button for the executive boardroom on the ground floor, my heart rate remained perfectly, flawlessly normal. I was completely ready to face the medical logistics executives and tear apart their fraudulent contractors. I would not let my family steal my career focus along with my money. I would conduct my presentation, I would secure my firm victory, and I would do it with a smile, because Pamela and Blair Carter had made a massive, fundamentally fatal miscalculation. The two women who had just robbed me blind, who genuinely thought they had executed the absolute perfect escape to a tropical paradise, completely forgot one crucial, undeniable detail about the daughter they left behind. Tracking stolen money, hunting down hidden offshore assets, and ruthlessly dismantling complex financial illusions is not just a hobby of mine, it is my literal profession. And they had just given me the most important case of my entire life. Growing up in the humid, deeply traditional suburbs of North Carolina, I learned a fundamental lesson about family dynamics very early on. In our household, being the stable child was not an achievement, it was a curse. Stability meant you were a void, a blank space that required no maintenance, no attention, and no emotional investment. Fragility, on the other hand, was the absolute center of gravity. My younger sister was the fragile one. She was the delicate bird with the broken wing, constantly needing to be rescued, constantly requiring a soft place to land. And my mother was the eternal, self-proclaimed martyr who lived to provide that soft landing. I was simply the ground they both stood on. I figured out quickly that if I wanted anything in this world, I was going to have to extract it from the earth with my own bare hands. While other teenagers were spending their weekends going to the lake or shopping at the local mall, I was working double shifts at a diner to save for college applications. When the time came for university, there were no college funds waiting for me. I paid my own tuition through a grueling combination of academic scholarships, highly competitive paid internships, and exhausting part-time jobs that kept me awake well past midnight. I built my life brick by heavy brick. Blair took a completely different path. She viewed life as a buffet of experiences where someone else always picked up the check. She enrolled in 3 different liberal arts colleges and dropped out of every single one before completing a sophomore year, citing crippling anxiety or a sudden lack of passion. Her 20s were a chaotic blur of abandoned career paths, spectacular romantic failures, and half-baked business ideas that always required seed money she never actually possessed. Every time Blair fell, my mother was right there to catch her, usually cushioning the fall with whatever limited resources our family had available. The real shift, the event that truly cemented the trap I eventually found myself in, happened when my stepfather passed away suddenly from a massive stroke. It was a tragedy, of course, but for my mother, it was also a profound loss of infrastructure. Within weeks of the funeral, Pamela sat weeping at my kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held a lukewarm mug of tea. She looked at me with red, tear-filled eyes and swore she could not survive in their old house alone. The memories were simply too painful, the silence too deafening. She begged to stay with me for just a few short months to recover her mental strength. I was not heartless, I agreed. I had just closed on a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a quiet, affluent suburb of Charlotte. I bought that house entirely on my own. I saved for the down payment by skipping vacations, driving a used sedan with a failing transmission, and putting half my paycheck into a savings account for 5 long years. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it became a shelter. Those few short months of grieving seamlessly stretched into nearly 3 solid years. My mother moved into the main guest room, unpacked her entire life, and simply never discussed leaving. The temporary arrangement became permanent through a series of unspoken assumptions. Then, inevitably, came Blair. Exactly 14 months after my mother moved in, my sister arrived on my doorstep with 3 oversized suitcases and a dramatic story about a toxic breakup. She was also drowning in a mountain of high-interest credit card debt that she could not even begin to service. Like my mother, Blair claimed it was just a temporary pit stop. She needed a safe space to get back on her feet, find a new job, and figure out her next steps. The second guest room down the hall was claimed. My sanctuary was completely overrun. Before I fully realized what was happening, I became the sole financial pillar for 3 grown adults. I paid the monthly mortgage without a single contribution from either of them. I covered the soaring homeowner insurance premiums. When the air conditioning unit died in the middle of a sweltering July, I was the one who wrote the crushing check for the emergency repairs. I bought all the groceries, filling the refrigerator week after week with the premium organic brands my sister insisted she needed for her sensitive digestion. I paid the exorbitant property taxes every single year. It did not stop at the foundational expenses. I also became the silent safety net for their constant, manufactured emergencies. When my sister needed new brake pads, so she could supposedly drive to job interviews, I paid the mechanic. When my mother developed a sudden, desperate need for an expensive holistic wellness retreat to manage her lingering grief. She looked at me with those sad, expectant eyes until I pulled out my credit card. Pamela was a master of manipulation. She never outright demanded money. She was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, she used a deeply insidious, sacrificial language that twisted the reality of our situation. She would constantly sigh and talk about how family always takes care of family, how the world is a cold place and we only have each other, and how blessed they were that I was strong enough to carry the burden. She weaponized my own competence against me. She made me feel that writing those checks, absorbing their debts, and funding their lives was not an act of being exploited, but a sacred moral duty. If I ever pushed back, if I ever dared to suggest they contribute to the household or find steady employment, I was immediately painted as the cold, calculating corporate executive who cared more about her bank balance than her own flesh and blood. I spent years swallowing the resentment, telling myself that this was just what good daughters and good sisters did. I convinced myself that eventually they would find their footing. I believed that one day they would look around, realize how much I had sacrificed to keep a roof over their heads, and feel a profound sense of gratitude. I remember one specific evening, about 2 years into our collective living arrangement, sitting at the kitchen island surrounded by stacks of paper bills. I was calculating the monthly overhead, trying to figure out how to stretch my annual bonus to cover a sudden, massive increase in the property taxes. Pamela walked in, wearing a plush silk robe I had purchased for her birthday, and poured herself a glass of filtered water. She saw the stress radiating from my posture, the pen gripped tightly in my hand. Instead of asking how she could help or offering to get a part-time job to ease the load, she simply patted my shoulder. She smiled a gentle, devastatingly empty smile and whispered that God gives his hardest battles to his strongest soldiers. Then she took her water and went back to the living room to watch television, leaving me alone with the suffocating weight of their survival. That was the moment the illusion of family loyalty truly began to fracture. It was not a partnership, it was a hostage situation disguised as maternal love. I started paying attention to the way they looked at my things. The way Blair would casually borrow my expensive designer coats without asking and return them stained. The way my mother would invite her friends over for lavish afternoon luncheons, pouring the vintage wine I had purchased to celebrate my promotions, acting as if she were the lady of the manor. They never asked how much things cost, because the concept of cost was entirely foreign to them as long as it was my name on the billing statement. The agonizing realization hit me slowly, and then all at once. The scariest thing about my family was not that they secretly hated me. If they hated me, they would have simply packed up their bags and left my house to find another victim. No, the truth was far more chilling than pure hatred. They did not view me as a person at all. They did not see a daughter who needed love, or a sister who needed support, or even a human being who experienced exhaustion. They looked at me and saw a highly efficient cash machine. They honestly, truly believed that my discipline, my long hours, and my success were not my own individual achievements. They believed that everything I possessed, from the roof over our heads to the balance in my investment portfolios, was a collective family resource that belonged to them by right. And in their deeply distorted reality, I was not a generous benefactor to be thanked. I was simply the designated provider, completely obligated by the ties of blood to fund their perpetual adolescence. They felt entitled to my money, my space, and my peace of mind, and they were completely willing to drain me dry without a single ounce of genuine remorse. The shift did not happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping rot that subtly infected the daily routines of my house. I began to notice a distinct change in the atmospheric pressure of our interactions. It started with the questions. My mother, a woman who historically showed absolutely zero interest in financial literacy beyond knowing how to swipe a piece of plastic at a department store, suddenly developed a profound curiosity about modern banking security. We would be sitting in the living room, a mindless television show playing in the background, when she would casually ask about my investment portfolios. Her tone was always light, breezy, Carefully constructed to sound like idle, harmless chatter, she would ask how two-factor authentication actually worked. She wondered aloud, swirling a glass of red wine, how the bank verified my identity if I called them from a different time zone. One Sunday afternoon, while pretending to read a glossy lifestyle magazine, she asked who the primary beneficiary was on my accounts if my plane happened to crash during a cross-country business trip. She framed it entirely as a mother worrying about her daughter living a high-stress, solitary life. But I am a corporate investigator. I listen to the cadence of deceit for a living. Her voice lacked the genuine anxiety of maternal concern. It carried the sharp, highly inquisitive edge of someone gathering tactical reconnaissance. Then there was my sister. Blair had spent the last 2 years actively avoiding any household chore that required more than 3 minutes of sustained physical effort. Suddenly, she morphed into the most helpful person on the planet. I would come home from a grueling 12-hour day at the firm to find her standing in the foyer, brightly handing me the Daily Mail. She started volunteering to organize the scattered paperwork in my home office. One evening, I walked into my study to find my heavy mahogany desk completely rearranged. My file trays had been sorted, my stray receipts stacked neatly into perfectly aligned piles. Blair stood by the window, smiling a sugary, sweet smile, claiming she just wanted to do something nice to lighten my heavy workload. I thanked her, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression, but my stomach coiled into a tight, cold knot. I know exactly where every single piece of paper on my desk belongs. I possess a photographic memory for my own organizational chaos. The physical geography of my workspace had been meticulously disturbed, searched, and then put back together by someone desperately trying to mimic the original layout. My suspicions crystallized a few days later. I was sitting at the kitchen counter, sorting through a fresh stack of mail that Blair had so graciously brought inside from the mailbox. I picked up a standard, white rectangular envelope from my primary wealth management institution. To an untrained eye, a casual observer just bringing in the afternoon post, it looked completely normal. But I do not have an untrained eye. My entire career is built upon noticing the tiny, fractional discrepancies that ordinary people overlook. I ran my thumb along the back flap of the paper. The adhesive felt slightly thicker than usual, slightly more rigid under the pad of my finger. I held the envelope up to the overhead pendant light in the kitchen. The top edge of the paper flap was misaligned by perhaps 1/16 of an inch. It was an almost imperceptible flaw, a tiny shadow where there should have been none. Someone had steamed or carefully pried the envelope open, read the quarterly financial statement inside, and then resealed it using a tiny amount of generic household glue stick. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I did not march upstairs to confront them. I did not yell. I simply slid the tampered envelope into my leather briefcase, snapped the brass lock shut, and walked out the door to go to work. The feeling of being hunted in my own home grew suffocating, transforming my house from a sanctuary into a highly hostile environment. Late one Thursday night, the heavy, oppressive silence of the house was broken by a low, rhythmic, mechanical hum. I had been asleep for several hours. I slipped out of bed, walking silently down the dark hardwood hallway in my bare feet, carefully avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. The noise was coming directly from my home office. The solid oak door was cracked open just a fraction of an inch, spilling a sharp sliver of pale yellow light onto the floor. I moved closer, holding my breath, and peered through the narrow gap. Blair was standing over my heavy-duty, all-in-one printer. The scanner bar was flashing a bright, blinding white light across the glass flatbed, illuminating her face in harsh, rapid bursts. She was holding a thick stack of my previous year tax returns, wage forms, and discarded investment statements. I specifically remembered tossing those exact documents into the blue plastic recycling bin under my desk just 2 days prior, intending to run them through the cross-cut shredder the following weekend. Blair was systematically copying every single page. She moved with a tense, hurried energy, her eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. I stood in the dark hallway for 5 full minutes, watching my own sister meticulously steal my financial identity page by page, The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth, but I did not push the door open. I turned around and walked back to my bedroom like a ghost, slipping back under the covers with my eyes wide open until the sun came up. The surveillance did not end there. My mother adopted a new, highly disturbing habit. Whenever I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop to pay monthly bills or manage my accounts, Pamela would inevitably find a random reason to enter the room. She would wipe down the already clean granite countertops, rearrange the fruit bowl, or simply stand in the doorway holding a dry dish towel. She always kept her face perfectly blank, wearing a meticulously crafted mask of polite indifference, but I could see her reflection in the dark, polished glass of the oven door. Her eyes were not on the fruit bowl. Her eyes were intensely, hungrily locked onto my laptop screen. She was actively tracking the movements of my fingers across the keyboard. She was watching the screen load, trying to memorize account numbers, balances, and security protocols. The growing paranoia finally pushed me to do what I do best. I opened a secure, encrypted browser and pulled the back-end security logs from my personal email server. I filtered the access data for the past 60 days. The results were a glaring, undeniable red flag. There were 4 separate, distinct attempts to request password recovery codes. These attempts did not happen at random times. They occurred precisely on a Tuesday afternoon and a Wednesday morning when I was completely unreachable, sitting in a windowless conference room in Chicago for a legal deposition. Furthermore, the Internet Protocol address attached to those specific recovery requests belonged to my own home wireless network. Someone sitting in my living room had tried to force their way into my digital vault while they knew I was 1,000 miles away. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place exactly 3 days later. I logged into a secondary, low-yield savings account that I rarely monitored. There, sitting quietly in the pending transaction queue, was an unauthorized electronic transfer request. It was not a massive sum. It was for exactly $350. It was directed to an anonymous, prepaid digital wallet service. An amateur might write it off as a computer glitch or a minor case of forgotten debit card fraud. But I recognized the tactic instantly. It is a classic move in financial exploitation. The perpetrator initiates a tiny, seemingly insignificant transaction to test the perimeter alarms. They want to see if the victim notices the missing funds. They want to see if the bank fraud department flags the unusual activity. They are checking the temperature of the water before they dive in. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing numbers on the screen. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. Every isolated incident, the casual questions, the resealed mail, the midnight copying session, the hovering mother, the digital footprint, and the test transfer, suddenly connected to form a horrifyingly clear picture. A profound, bone-chilling realization settled deep into the marrow of my bones. This was no longer a case of a lazy sister and a dependent mother taking advantage of a highly convenient living situation. This was no longer spontaneous greed or opportunistic mooching. The erratic behavior had hardened into a deliberate, focused strategy. They were actively studying my defenses. They were meticulously mapping my vulnerabilities. They were quietly, methodically gathering the keys to my kingdom. It was a calculated, heavily premeditated plan, and the countdown to my ruin had already begun. I did not burst into the living room and demand answers. I am a professional investigator. When you discover a security breach, you do not immediately alert the intruders. You secure the perimeter. I stepped out to my car, started the engine to ensure the ambient noise would mask my voice, and called my personal attorney. Noah Halpern is a shark dressed in custom wool suits. He is a man who specializes specifically in complex asset disputes and federal civil fraud. I laid out the anomalies I had observed over the past few weeks. Noah did not offer any emotional sympathy, which is precisely why I pay him a high hourly rate. He told me to bite my tongue and treat my own home like an active financial crime scene. Confrontation would only trigger the immediate destruction of evidence. I had to let the intrusion run its course while I quietly built an impenetrable fortress around my capital. The first order of business was the liquid cash. I could not simply drain my checking and savings accounts overnight. If Pamela or Blair peered over my shoulder and saw a zero balance, they would instantly panic. That panic would force them to pivot their strategy. Perhaps stealing physical items immediately, or taking out massive credit lines using my social security number. Instead of hiding the money, I executed a highly sophisticated financial shell game. Working closely with Noah and a trusted fiduciary custodian, I moved the vast majority of my actual wealth into a specialized, restricted trust structure. It was an investment vehicle that required physical, notarized signatures and direct, dual verification from both my attorney and the holding firm before a single cent could be moved. However, to the casual observer glancing at my laptop screen, the primary dashboard still displayed a very healthy, very liquid number hovering right around $500,000. It was a digital mirage. It was a perfectly painted target designed to keep the predators focused exactly where I wanted them. They truly thought they had found the mother lode. They had no idea they were simply staring at a brick wall painted to look like an open vault door. Next, I ruthlessly hardened the digital entry points. I scheduled an in-person meeting with my private wealth manager. I completely removed all text message verification protocols from my profiles, knowing full well how easily a phone number could be spoofed or a physical mobile device could be intercepted while it charged on my kitchen counter. I replaced the standard security measures with a biometric voice passphrase. I also added a secondary, hard-coded physical security key that remained securely locked in a hidden compartment inside my work briefcase. Furthermore, I instituted incredibly strict geographic restrictions on every single account. If any transaction over $100 was initiated outside the state lines of North Carolina, the banking system would immediately freeze the funds and trigger a direct alert to the office of my attorney. I wanted to see them try to wire my life savings from a sandy beach halfway across the Pacific Ocean, with the digital front entirely secured. I turned my attention to the physical assets scattered throughout my property. Over the course of 3 long nights, after my mother had taken her evening sleeping pills and my sister had retreated to her bedroom, I conducted a meticulous, forensic inventory of my own house. I moved through the dark rooms like a shadow. I used a specialized scanning application on my mobile phone to photograph every single piece of heirloom jewelry, every luxury watch, and every original oil painting hanging on the walls. I crawled under desks and behind entertainment centers to document the manufacturer's serial numbers of all high-end electronics. I compiled flawless digital copies of my property deeds, vehicle titles, and comprehensive insurance policies. But digital copies are often not enough for a demanding court of law. I gathered the physical original documents, along with my most irreplaceable family keepsakes and vintage photographs, boxed them up securely, and quietly moved them to a climate-controlled private storage unit across town during my lunch hour. If they were planning to clean out the house while I was gone, they were only going to get the easily replaceable surface layer. The true foundation of my life was already safely locked away. The final phase of my preparation was a complete surveillance overhaul. My mother and my sister thought they were the ones actively watching me. They were entirely wrong. I systematically took control of the entire security ecosystem of the property, entirely without their knowledge. I remotely reset the administrative passwords on the indoor hallway cameras and the front doorbell system, permanently locking out any secondary user profiles they might have secretly created. I contacted the management office of my gated community and formally requested a comprehensive daily export of the front gate access logs, ensuring I would know exactly which vehicles came and went from my driveway. I established an automatic, heavily encrypted cloud backup for my home internet router, logging every single device connection and website query that occurred within my walls. And as a final, deeply satisfying touch, I installed a hidden background tracking software program on my home office network printer. If Blair decided to scan another tax document or bank statement in the middle of the night, I would instantly receive a high-resolution digital copy directly to my private, secure server before the paper even left the glass flatbed. Everything was perfectly in place. The snare was flawlessly woven, completely invisible to the naked eye, and legally airtight. The only thing left to do was provide the two women living in my house with the perfect opportunity to walk right into it. The following Tuesday evening, I sat down at the dinner table. I let out a long, carefully rehearsed sigh of deep professional exhaustion. I looked at my mother and announced that my consulting firm was sending me on a massive, highly intensive compliance audit. I told them I would be flying to Phoenix, Arizona, and that I would be gone for several days. I explicitly emphasized that I would be trapped in endless corporate boardroom meetings with absolutely zero time to check my personal phone or manage the daily operations of the house. The reaction was immediate, and it was entirely damning. There was no whining about me being away from home. There were no dramatic complaints about them having to manage the trash collection or the grocery shopping by themselves for a few days. My mother simply smiled. It was a serene, chilling expression of pure predatory anticipation. She reached across the table, patted my hand, and told me not to worry about a single thing at home because they had everything completely under control. Blair chimed in eagerly, offering to drive me to the airport at dawn, her eyes sparkling with an unnatural, electric excitement. Their overwhelming, highly suspicious calm was the final piece of psychological evidence I needed. They were not just waiting for an opportunity to strike, they were waiting for this specific opportunity. I finished my dinner, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. I went upstairs and packed my single suitcase, knowing full well that by the time I returned from the desert, my house would likely be completely empty. But I also knew, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that I currently held the precise map to every single thing they were about to steal. I departed Charlotte on a brisk, overcast Tuesday morning. I carried exactly one piece of rolling luggage and a highly encrypted flash drive containing the singular presentation that possessed the power to elevate me to a full equity partner at Blackridge Recovery Partners. The flight to Phoenix was uneventful. I spent the entire 4 hours in the air reviewing financial discrepancies and corporate compliance structures, intentionally pushing the looming domestic catastrophe to the absolute farthest corners of my mind. The trap was set. My physical presence was no longer required to spring it. On the morning of the second day, right as I approached the gleaming brass elevator banks to descend to the executive levels, the notification chimed. It was the message from my mother, the one I had anticipated with a cold, hollow certainty. As I stood in the carpeted hallway, watching the digital floor indicator tick downward, I analyzed the specific language she and my sister chose to employ. Pamela possessed a truly breathtaking capacity for cognitive dissonance. In her meticulously typed message, she outright rejected the concept of theft. She framed her actions not as a crime, but as an act of cosmic justice. She claimed she was not stealing anything whatsoever. Instead, she boldly declared she was simply taking the collective family resources and finally putting them into the hands of the people who actually knew how to live. It was a staggering display of entitlement, a rationalization so deeply ingrained that she truly believed she was the righteous protagonist in this scenario. Blair, never one to miss an opportunity to twist the knife, had appended her own distinct message at the bottom of the digital correspondence. Her words were laced with a poisonous, mocking pity. She informed me that the vibrant shores of Hawaii were going to be vastly superior to the cold, sterile, relentlessly ambitious office life I had apparently chosen over my own flesh and blood. They were framing my discipline as a tragic personality flaw, and their parasitic extraction of my wealth as a vibrant liberation. I stepped to the side of the hallway, out of the main flow of corporate foot traffic. I bypassed the email application entirely and opened the discrete security portal on my mobile device, the software connected to the hidden surveillance network I had established. The live video feed from the front of my property materialized on the small screen in crystal-clear high definition. The visual confirmation hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. There, parked brazenly across my manicured front lawn, was a massive, battered white rental box truck. Two large, unidentified men in heavy work boots and stained cotton shirts were systematically marching up and down the concrete pathway. I tapped the screen to access the interior cameras. My beautiful, meticulously curated home was being completely gutted, The heavy, custom-upholstered linen sofa I had waited 6 months to have delivered was being hoisted awkwardly through the double doors. The men moved back inside to grab the antique walnut console table, scraping the solid wood against the doorframe. I watched them dismantle my prized wine cabinet, carelessly tossing expensive vintages into generic cardboard boxes. They hauled out massive canvas paintings, heavy designer suitcases, and most tellingly, a series of specific, unassuming plastic storage bins from the back of my closet. Those bins contained high-value, easily liquidated designer accessories, items a casual burglar would never know to look for. Only someone who lived in that house, someone who had watched my purchasing habits for years, would know exactly which unmarked containers held the real treasure. Then, the audio feed crackled to life. The microphone on the hallway camera picked up the sharp, commanding tone of my sister. Blair walked into the frame, holding a clipboard and a half-empty cup of iced coffee, directing the hired muscle with the authority of a seasoned warehouse manager. I heard her voice echo through my empty foyer, loud and distinct. She pointed toward my home office and barked an order to the two men, telling them to strictly prioritize taking the sellable items first and to leave the boring paperwork for later. She was calculating the immediate street value of my life possessions in real time, orchestrating the swift liquidation of my sanctuary to fund her tropical escape. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her command, a secondary notification popped onto my screen. It was a direct text from a mutual college acquaintance, a woman who still tangentially followed my sister on various social media platforms. The text contained a single, glaring screenshot. It was an image pulled from a highly restricted, private story Blair had posted just moments before boarding their outbound flight. The photograph showed a first-class airline cabin tray table. Resting on the tray was a tall, elegant glass of expensive, bubbling champagne. In the background, out the oval window, the sun was rising over the airport tarmac. Superimposed over the image, in a bright, obnoxious digital font, was a caption that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. It read, "Island reset. Family money finally put to good use. They were toasting to my ruin." They were drinking premium alcohol purchased with the money I earned analyzing balance sheets at midnight. They were publicly celebrating their successful extraction. A blinding, white-hot rage flared behind my eyes. The urge to act recklessly was suddenly overwhelming. Every human instinct screamed at me to abandon the hotel, rush to the nearest airport terminal, and hunt them down across the country. I wanted to call the local police department and demand they intercept the moving truck. I wanted to tear down my carefully constructed professional facade and scream until my voice gave out. I closed my eyes. I felt the smooth, cold metal of the phone casing against my palm. I took a deep, agonizing breath, forcing the violent surge of emotion down into a tight, hard sphere in the center of my chest. I am a woman who builds things. I do not destroy my own foundations just because someone else set a fire on the porch. The presentation I held in my hands represented hundreds of hours of painstaking labor. It represented my future, my independence, and my undeniable value in the corporate world. Pamela and Blair had already stolen my furniture, my savings, and my trust. I would absolutely be damned if I allowed them to reach across the country and steal my professional honor as well. I slid the phone into my jacket pocket. I walked into the elevator and descended to the executive floor. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom and faced a long table of intimidating, highly critical corporate directors. For the next 3 hours, I did not exist as a betrayed daughter or an exploited sister. I existed solely as a lethal, razor-sharp instrument of financial justice. I delivered the presentation of my life. I dissected the fraudulent logistics contracts with merciless precision. I answered every hostile question without a single moment of hesitation. I projected absolute, unshakable confidence, channeling every ounce of my seething anger into dominating the room. I secured my path to partnership at the firm. I shook hands, accepted the accolades, and maintained a flawless, professional smile until the very last executive exited the suite. Only then, standing alone in the quiet, empty boardroom overlooking the sprawling desert landscape. Did I allow myself to pull my phone back out? I opened a travel application and methodically booked a direct, overnight flight back to North Carolina. The presentation was over. The career victory was secured. Now, it was time to fly home to an empty house and formally begin the hunt. I unlocked the front door of my house in Charlotte late Wednesday night, exhausted from the cross-country flight but fueled by a cold, humming adrenaline. The heavy wooden door swung open with a soft click, and instead of the familiar, comforting warmth of my foyer, I was immediately hit by a wall of stagnant, hollow air. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The sharp, rhythmic tap of my leather heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed violently, bouncing off the bare walls and soaring into the high ceilings. The acoustics of my own home had fundamentally changed. It sounded exactly like I was trespassing in a stranger's abandoned, foreclosed property. The silence was absolute, heavy, and deeply unsettling. I walked slowly into the main living room, dragging my single suitcase behind me. The large, open space was stripped down to the bare drywall and carpet. The massive oak dining table, the one I had saved up for months to purchase, and where I had spent countless holidays serving them elaborate meals, was completely gone. The faint, rectangular indentations in the plush rug were the only physical proof it had ever existed. I looked toward the corner window. The vintage brass reading lamp that had belonged to my late stepfather, the one Pamela consistently claimed she could not possibly sleep without due to her fragile emotional state, had vanished. I walked upstairs, the wooden stairs creaking louder than usual without the muffling presence of furniture, and opened my bedroom closet. The intricately carved wooden jewelry box that my grandmother had given me on my 18th birthday was missing from its dedicated shelf. I felt a sharp, twisting pain in the center of my chest. It was not the loss of the expensive designer bags or the high-end electronics that made my throat constrict. It was the petty, vindictive removal of the genuinely worthless sentimental objects. They had taken framed photographs of me as a child, old concert ticket stubs I kept in a glass jar, and cheap, chipped ceramic mugs we had painted together at a pottery class years ago. They had meticulously, intentionally swept the house clean of anything that anchored me to my own past. It was a vicious psychological tactic. They were actively deciding that I simply did not deserve to retain a single warm memory of our family, treating my history as just another asset to be liquidated or discarded without a second thought. I forced myself to breathe evenly and move down the hallway, pushing open the solid door to my home office. Unlike the rest of the house, which had been cleanly emptied, this room had been hastily ransacked. Desk drawers were pulled open and left hanging. Empty manila folders were scattered carelessly across the geometric rug, and the metal trash can had been dumped out onto the floor. But Blair, in her arrogant, greedy haste, had made a critical, amateur mistake. Tucked underneath the back edge of my heavy-duty network printer, the very same machine I had secretly wired with tracking software, was a crumpled piece of yellow legal paper. I pulled the paper out and smoothed it flat on the bare desktop. It was covered in my sister's distinctly messy, loopy handwriting. I stared at the ink, my jaw clenching. It was a highly detailed, multi-columned inventory list. The columns were titled with a brutal, calculating pragmatism: sell first, bring along, leave behind. Under the first column, she had listed my high-end electronics, the oak dining table, the leather sofa, and my collection of vintage watches. Under the second column were my heirloom jewelry, specific pieces of my designer wardrobe, and her own beauty products. Under the third column were things like my heavy winter coats, my corporate tax binders, and old college textbooks. I traced the letters with my index finger. This single, discarded piece of yellow paper was the absolute holy grail of civil litigation. It entirely obliterated any future defense they might attempt to construct. This was not a sudden, emotionally driven departure born of an explosive family conflict. It was a cold, premeditated, heavily documented extraction plan that had been orchestrated for weeks right under my nose. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, opened my laptop, and immediately connected to my secure cloud servers. I bypassed the compromised home network and used a secure mobile hotspot to pull the raw data from the community gate management system. The digital logs were incredibly precise and completely unforgiving. They documented a massive commercial moving truck entering the neighborhood gates at exactly 8:15 on Tuesday morning, just hours after my outbound flight to Phoenix had taken off. The logs recorded the exact license plate number, the driver identification, and the corporate registry of the rental company. But the most damning visual evidence did not come from my own compromised systems. It came from across the street. I sent a quiet, polite text message to my neighbor, a highly vigilant retired police officer who maintained an overly robust, military-grade home security system. Within 10 minutes, he emailed me a continuous, time-stamped video file. The high-definition footage perfectly captured the entire length of my driveway. I pressed play and watched the betrayal unfold in vivid color. It showed my mother, Pamela, standing on my manicured front lawn, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and holding a clipboard. She was not crying. She was not experiencing a tragic mental breakdown. She was energetically pointing at my expensive furniture, directing the hired movers with the sharp, authoritative gestures of an experienced warehouse forewoman. She was the calm, collected architect overseeing the systematic demolition of my life. My phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning. It was the senior fraud investigator from my primary banking institution, calling on a secure, monitored line Noah had established for me. The investigator possessed a sterile, highly professional voice that contrasted sharply with the massive personal betrayal we were discussing. He confirmed exactly what I already suspected, but hearing the official words spoken aloud solidified the new reality. The massive $500,000 wire transfer they had attempted to execute had immediately triggered every single silent alarm I had installed. The bank's automated security systems recognized the highly abnormal authentication chain, instantly flagged the out-of-state geographic ping from the Hawaiian terminal they tried to route the money through, and immediately froze the primary trust accounts. The grand, life-altering prize they thought they had secured was entirely illusory. They had tried to drain the ocean, but only hit a solid glass wall. However, they had not walked away completely empty-handed. The investigator read down the ledger of my smaller, auxiliary accounts that were not legally tied to the primary trust structure. They had managed to successfully siphon roughly $12,000 in liquid cash from a secondary emergency checking account. Furthermore, the bank confirmed that 2 highly expensive, one-way business class airline tickets to Oahu had successfully cleared my secondary corporate credit card before I could lock it. More infuriatingly, a massive security deposit and the first 3 months of rent for a luxury, short-term apartment lease in Kailua had also been processed. They were bleeding my auxiliary, unprotected lines of credit to comfortably fund their immediate, luxurious landing in paradise. But the financial theft was not the bottom of the abyss. As I spent the next several hours running comprehensive credit checks, pulling utility records, and speaking with various fraud departments, I uncovered a secondary layer of violation that completely shifted the paradigm of their betrayal. I noticed strange, unprompted inquiries on my credit report originating from telecom companies and municipal utility providers located in Honolulu. I dug deeper, accessing the customer service portals using my remaining secure credentials. Pamela and Blair had not just stolen my money to start a fresh, independent life. They had actively, maliciously used my social security number, my pristine credit score, and my date of birth to open multiple service contracts in Hawaii. They had set up high-speed internet, electricity, water, and premium cellular phone plans entirely under my name. Even worse, they had contacted several of my minor financial institutions and successfully changed the primary contact mailing address and email address to a newly created, dummy account they fully controlled, effectively intercepting my digital mail and locking me out of my own notifications. I sat alone on the cold hardwood floor of my empty living room, the glowing laptop screen illuminating the long shadows stretching across the bare walls. The true, horrifying magnitude of their plan finally washed over me, chilling me to the bone, The realization was a paralyzing, sickening shock to my system. My mother and my sister never intended to simply take my cash and disappear into the sunset, leaving me in peace. They intended to take my cash and then forcibly tether me to their new existence. They were planning to use my very identity, my meticulously built professional reputation, and my flawless financial credibility as a permanent, invisible safety net to subsidize their tropical fantasy forever. They wanted me to unknowingly pay for the lights, the water, and the internet of the paradise they had built on my ruined foundation. The geographical distance between North Carolina and the Hawaiian Islands is roughly 4,700 miles. To my mother and my sister, that vast expanse of ocean and landmass represented an impenetrable shield. They genuinely believed that by putting 6 time zones between us, they had crossed into a jurisdiction where my influence simply ceased to exist. They fundamentally failed to understand how modern federal law operates, and they completely underestimated the reach of a well-funded, highly motivated corporate attorney. I sat in my empty living room, the cold floor biting through my clothes, and dialed Noah Halpern. I did not waste time with pleasantries or emotional breakdowns. I relayed the newest discoveries regarding the stolen identity and the compromised service contracts. Noah listened in total silence, the faint sound of his pen scratching against a legal pad echoing through the receiver. When I finished, he did not sigh. He simply stated that it was time to activate the network. By noon the following day, Noah had officially retained local counsel in Honolulu. Her name was Leona Price. Leona was a highly aggressive, deeply connected civil litigator who specialized in tracing laundered assets through the complex real estate markets of the Pacific Rim. While Noah constructed the overarching federal strategy in Charlotte, Leona became our boots on the ground in the tropics. She moved with a terrifying, immediate efficiency that made my own corporate heart swell with grim satisfaction. Within 24 hours of being retained, Leona had successfully located the exact physical address of the luxury apartment Pamela and Blair were occupying. It was a high-end, fully furnished oceanfront rental situated in an exclusive enclave near Kailua. But Leona did not just find the building, she acquired a digitized copy of the master lease agreement. When I opened the secure file Leona sent to my laptop, my eyes immediately locked onto the guarantor's signature line at the bottom of the 4th page. There, rendered in clean digital ink, was my name. The rental agreement had not merely been secured using the $12,000 stolen from my secondary checking account. The entire legal liability of the expensive 12-month lease had been fraudulently anchored to my Social Security number using a forged electronic signature. Leona did not politely ask the Hawaiian property management firm for an explanation. She executed a beautifully ruthless legal maneuver. She contacted the senior leasing director of the Kailua complex and casually, firmly introduced herself. She informed the director that their luxury property was currently harboring 2 fugitives actively engaged in cross-state identity theft and federal wire fraud. She clearly articulated that the security deposit resting in their corporate escrow account was comprised entirely of stolen funds. The leasing director, initially dismissive and protective of his wealthy new tenants, experienced a sudden, spectacular shift in perspective. The terrifying realization that his firm could be indicted as an accessory to federal financial crimes dissolved his resistance instantly. Panicked and eager to cooperate with the impending federal subpoenas, the manager voluntarily surrendered every piece of communication, every payment ledger, and every Internet Protocol address log associated with my mother and sister. While Leona squeezed the property manager in Hawaii, I turned my analytical focus back to the heavy logistics of the physical theft in North Carolina. I had the license plate of the moving truck, but commercial freight requires waybills, manifests, and transit hubs. I used the truck's routing data, the rental records, and the freight trail to reconstruct where it had gone. I pulled the global positioning tracking history of the specific truck parked on my lawn. The digital map plotted a route that made my stomach turn. The truck did not drive to a long-term storage facility or a shipping port. It drove directly to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city, stopping at a massive, well-known estate liquidation warehouse. I cross-referenced the timestamps with local online auction databases. The results were sickeningly clear. Blair had not merely packed up my heavy oak dining table, my vintage leather sofa, and my collection of antique watches. She had actively pre-sold them to a wholesale liquidator a full 48 hours before they even boarded their flight to Honolulu. They were not shipping my life across the ocean. They were actively fencing my possessions, converting my physical memories into untraceable cash while I was still packing my single suitcase for my business trip. Every new discovery was a heavy iron door swinging open to reveal an even darker, more malicious secret behind it. But the ultimate weapon, the piece of evidence that would completely annihilate any future legal defense they might attempt to mount, did not come from a subpoena or a hacked database. It came from the state of Ohio. My phone rang late Thursday evening. The caller identification displayed the name of my father's sister, a distant aunt whom our immediate family rarely spoke to. She sounded deeply uncomfortable, her voice trembling slightly over the cellular connection. She told me that Pamela had called her 3 days ago, practically hyperventilating, and left a highly disturbing message on her answering machine. My aunt, sensing something fundamentally wrong, had used her smartphone to record the audio playback and was forwarding it to my email. I opened the audio file. The sound of my mother's voice filled the empty, echoing room. The meticulously crafted, falsely sweet tone she used to manipulate me for years was completely gone. Her voice was sharp, frantic, and dripping with raw, unfiltered calculation. "I need you to wire $500 to Blair's new account." Pamela hissed into the receiver, the background noise of an airport terminal clearly audible behind her words. "We are leaving. We have to go right now. We have to get on this plane before Reese figures out the routing numbers and locks all the accounts down completely. Do not call her. Do not tell her anything." I played the 30-second recording 5 times in a row. It was a flawless, undeniable admission of guilt. In legal terms, it established clear evidence of guilty intent. It was the absolute destruction of the narrative I knew they were planning to use. When the legal hammer finally fell, Pamela would undoubtedly try to cry in front of a judge. She would try to claim this was all just a tragic family misunderstanding, a temporary relocation meant to give everyone some space, and that she fully intended to return the funds. That single voicemail burned that defense to the ground. It proved, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it was illegal, and they were actively fleeing the jurisdiction to avoid my retaliation. The final revelation arrived from Leona Price just as the sun began to rise on Friday morning. She had spent the night running corporate registry sweeps through the Hawaiian Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs. She forwarded me a certified document that made me laugh out loud, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed off the bare walls of my ruined house. Blair had not just planned a permanent vacation. She had filed official articles of organization for a brand new limited liability company based in Honolulu. The registered name of the business was an obnoxious, pseudo-spiritual title, heavily implying a holistic healing and wellness retreat brand. I scanned the capitalization documents. The initial corporate bank account for this absurd vanity project had been opened with a direct $10,000 wire transfer. The origin of that transfer was the exact secondary emergency account they had drained from my portfolio. My younger sister, a woman who could not maintain a part-time job at a coffee shop for more than 3 weeks, was actively using my stolen money, the money I earned by dissecting corporate fraud, as the startup capital to brand herself as a spiritual healing guru in the Pacific Ocean. I closed the laptop screen. The sheer, blinding audacity of it all crystallized in my mind. The entire picture was finally, completely illuminated. This was not an impulsive decision born out of a sudden argument. It was not a desperate act by 2 women feeling financially trapped. It was a massive, highly sophisticated, multi-layered escape plan. Every single step, from the digital snooping in my kitchen to the forged Hawaiian leases and the corporate registrations, had been heavily premeditated for months. They had looked at my life, my career, and my relentless discipline, and they had not seen a daughter or a sister. They had seen a highly profitable, fully operational venture capital firm, and they had executed a hostile takeover. They thought they had successfully escaped to paradise on my dime. But as I sat in the cold, empty shell of the home they had destroyed, compiling the mountain of federal evidence against them, I knew one absolute truth. Hawaii was not nearly far enough away to protect them from what I was about to do. The battle over my stolen wealth was largely fought in the sterile silence of encrypted servers and legal offices, but the battle over my reputation erupted in the messy, highly public arena of my extended family. My mother and my sister realized very quickly that they could not beat me in a court of law. They knew I had the capital, the professional expertise, and the legal firepower to completely dismantle their tropical fantasy. Therefore, they decided to launch a vicious counteroffensive where the rules of evidence did not apply. They decided to attack my character. The smear campaign began less than 48 hours after my phone call with Leona Price. My cell phone started ringing with incoming calls from numbers I had not seen in years. Aunts, distant cousins, and old family friends from North Carolina were suddenly reaching out, their voices dripping with a sickening mixture of misplaced pity and thinly veiled judgment. Pamela had spent her first 3 days in Hawaii working the phones. She crafted a masterful, completely inverted narrative of our living situation. In her tearful, dramatically embellished version of events, I was not the exhausted benefactor keeping a roof over their heads. I was a wealthy, sociopathic tyrant who had systematically isolated her elderly mother and emotionally fragile sister, leaving them with absolutely no way to live. She told everyone who would listen that I had hoarded my corporate salary, denied them basic necessities, and forced them to flee across the country just to survive. Blair amplified the lie using a different, decidedly more modern weapon. She took to social media, weaponizing the language of modern therapy to paint herself as a brave survivor. She did not mention the $500,000 she attempted to steal. She did not mention the stolen furniture or the forged lease agreements. Instead, she posted a series of carefully curated, heavily filtered photographs of the Hawaiian coastline, accompanied by vague, emotionally manipulative paragraphs. She wrote extensively about the devastating impact of financial control and the immense courage it took to finally escape a deeply toxic, narcissistic household. She framed their grand larceny as a journey of trauma recovery and spiritual liberation. The most terrifying part was not that they were lying. The terrifying part was that people actually believed them. For the very first time since I read that initial email in my hotel room in Phoenix, my absolute, ironclad resolve began to waver. I sat in my empty kitchen, scrolling through the supportive comments on my sister's online posts, reading messages from relatives telling Blair how proud they were of her bravery. A deep, suffocating nausea settled into my stomach. I was not afraid of losing the civil lawsuit. I possessed an airtight federal case. What broke my heart, what genuinely made my hands shake, was the profound realization that my own blood relatives were entirely willing to distort me into a monster to justify their own greed. They were rewriting the entire history of my adult life, erasing years of my crushing financial sacrifice, and replacing it with a fictional story where I was the villain. I drafted a massive, furious response. I typed out thousands of words detailing the unpaid mortgage, the stolen identity, the hidden tracking software, and the audio recording of my mother confessing to the theft. I wanted to publish the evidence for the entire world to see. I wanted to publicly humiliate them the way they were humiliating me. Before I hit the button to publish the response, I called Noah Halpern. He answered on the second ring, listened to my ragged breathing, and immediately ordered me to step away from the keyboard. Noah's voice was incredibly calm, serving as a cold splash of water against my burning anger. He told me that arguing with professional victims in the court of public opinion was a guaranteed loss. He explicitly instructed me not to post a single word online, not to write any long defensive statements, and absolutely not to try to justify my actions using emotion. The people who wanted to believe I was a monster were going to believe it regardless of the facts. Noah reminded me that social media likes do not hold any weight in a federal deposition. He told me to swallow the shame, let them spin their fairy tales, and fight back using only certified financial records and the relentless passage of time. I closed my laptop and forced myself to channel the visceral pain into actionable movement. If they wanted to play the role of the desperate, financially abused victims, I needed to completely destroy the foundation of that lie. I needed to prove they were parasites long before they ever bought those plane tickets. I walked up the narrow wooden stairs to the dusty, unfinished attic of my house. This was the only area the movers had not completely cleared out, mostly because it contained heavy, seemingly worthless cardboard boxes of old tax returns and archived mail. I spent 7 straight hours sitting on the fiberglass insulation, wearing a disposable mask, meticulously sifting through every single piece of paper my mother and sister had left behind in their frantic rush to liquidate the main floors. The first breakthrough came from a crumpled file folder jammed at the bottom of a plastic storage bin. I found 2 separate, fully executed consumer loan agreements. They were not massive sums of money, only a few $1,000s each, but the details were incredibly damning. Pamela had quietly taken out both high-interest loans over 9 months ago. She had explicitly used my home address as the primary residence and listed my own home telephone number as the verification contact. She had been secretly leveraging the physical stability of my property to borrow money she could never repay, long before she ever claimed I was driving them into poverty. But the absolute final nail in the coffin, the discovery that completely extinguished any lingering trace of familial guilt in my heart, was buried inside a glossy, oversized manila envelope shoved behind an old winter coat. I opened the flap and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. The papers were not recent. The date stamps printed in the bottom corners clearly indicated they had been generated over 8 full months ago. I stared at the pages, the ambient dust floating in the single beam of sunlight piercing through the attic window. They were premium real estate brochures for luxury beachfront properties in Honolulu. Attached to the glossy photos was a meticulously maintained spreadsheet detailing the exact cost of living in Oahu, including projected grocery bills, utility averages, and automobile shipping fees. And underneath the spreadsheet was a confirmed, scheduled itinerary for virtual apartment viewings, all dated half a year before our supposedly spontaneous family falling out. The shock of the discovery hit me differently this time. It did not bring tears. It did not bring a frantic urge to yell. It brought a profound, freezing clarity that hardened my spine into solid steel. My mother and my sister had never been pushed to the brink. They had never felt trapped or desperate. While I was working 60-hour weeks to pay for the groceries they ate and the roof over their heads, they had been sitting in my living room, drinking my wine, and quietly, methodically planning my financial execution. They had been pricing out their tropical retirement using my anticipated salary for nearly a year. I carried the files downstairs, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. The pain of the social media smear campaign completely evaporated. I did not care what my distant cousins thought of me anymore. I did not care if my aunts believed I was a cruel dictator. The women who raised me and grew up beside me were nothing more than calculated predators. Sitting at my empty desk, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would not accept a quiet, out-of-court settlement to save the family face. I would not accept a tearful, closed-door apology. I wanted every single stolen dollar returned to my accounts. I wanted the fraudulent leases canceled and the legal liabilities transferred directly to their names. I wanted an official, highly public legal record of their federal crimes. But most importantly, I wanted to legally and permanently sever their right to ever step foot inside my life again. The mandatory civil mediation took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in a sterile, glass-walled conference room in downtown Charlotte. My mother and my sister were legally compelled to fly back from their tropical sanctuary to attend. Pamela walked into the room radiating a deeply offensive, unearned confidence. She carried herself with the serene posture of a woman who genuinely believed this was nothing more than a formal family squabble. She honestly thought I would never possess the ruthless capacity to drag our bloodline through a public, highly humiliating legal spectacle. She expected me to fold under the pressure of keeping family secrets quiet. I did not come to negotiate. I walked through the double doors, wearing my sharpest tailored suit, accompanied by Noah Halpern. I did not offer a greeting. I sat directly across the polished mahogany table from them and placed a heavy stack of meticulously categorized, color-coded binders right in the center. The sound of the thick plastic hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. The blue binder contained the bank transaction logs. The red binder held the home surveillance footage and the gate entry records. The green binder housed the commercial shipping manifests and the forged Hawaiian lease agreements. The black binder held the transcribed voicemails, the print data logs, and the device history. The mediator, a neutral retired judge, formally opened the session. Before he could even finish his introductory remarks, the theatrical performances began. Blair immediately deployed her favorite tactic. She collapsed into a puddle of tears. She slumped in her expensive leather chair, burying her face in her hands, and began sobbing loudly. She pushed out a trembling, highly practiced monologue about how incredibly lost and overwhelmed she had been feeling. She swore, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion, that they were only planning to temporarily borrow the funds to secure a fresh start. She claimed they fully intended to pay every single penny back once her new holistic healing business took off. Pamela immediately flanked her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder and turning her gaze toward me. My mother tried to weaponize her maternal authority one last time. She adopted a tone of profound, disappointed sorrow. She looked at the mediator and painted a picture of a fractured family, claiming she was just a desperate mother trying to save her younger daughter from a mental breakdown. She looked directly into my eyes and softly demanded that I show some basic human compassion, begging me not to let a silly misunderstanding about money permanently destroy our family bond. I sat perfectly still. I let the silence stretch out for 10 excruciating seconds. Then, I turned my head slightly and gave Noah a single, almost imperceptible nod. Noah did not raise his voice. He simply reached forward, opened the green binder, and began sliding documents across the smooth table. The rhythmic sound of paper sliding against wood was the only noise in the room. He started with the forged electronic signatures. He laid out the time-stamped digital certificates, proving that the Hawaiian lease agreement was executed using a device completely unassociated with my physical location, yet bearing my exact digital fingerprint. He followed that with the Internet Protocol logs, definitively showing that the initial smaller cash transfers were initiated from a laptop sitting inside my own living room while I was provably sitting in a legal deposition in Chicago. The air in the room began to thin. The soft, sorrowful expressions on their faces began to crack, replaced by a rigid, terrifying tension. Noah then opened the red binder. He pulled out the handwritten inventory list Blair had carelessly dropped under the printer. He placed the yellow legal paper right in front of my sister, alongside the high-definition surveillance photographs of Pamela directing the moving crew. He clearly articulated that the categorization of my personal assets into columns marked for immediate liquidation was completed 3 full weeks before I even announced my business trip to Phoenix. The narrative of a sudden, desperate escape instantly evaporated into thin air. It was a cold, heavily calculated extraction, but the absolute crushing blow came from a voice completely outside the room. Noah tapped a button on the conference room speakerphone. Leona Price, dialing in directly from Honolulu, introduced herself to the mediator and the 2 women sitting across from me. Her voice was sharp, professional, and entirely devoid of mercy. Leona informed the room that she had spent the previous 72 hours executing emergency injunctions through the Hawaiian civil courts. She presented the undeniable financial paper trail, proving that the massive security deposit for the luxury apartment in Kailua, as well as the initial $10,000 capital investment for my sister's new healing retreat business, were entirely funded by the disputed, stolen capital from my accounts. Leona then delivered the knockout punch. Because the funds were definitively traced to an act of cross-state fraud, the Hawaiian properties and business accounts were no longer considered private assets. They were legally classified as the direct proceeds of a crime. Therefore, the court had officially granted a complete freeze on the apartment lease and the corporate bank accounts. Pamela physically recoiled as if she had been struck across the face. The blood completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. The smug confidence she carried into the room shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She finally understood the horrific reality of her situation. The beautiful sunny paradise they thought they had successfully stolen was not a safe refuge at all. The Hawaiian island had officially become the secondary crime scene of a massive federal investigation, and they were entirely trapped inside it without a single dollar to their names. The carefully constructed alliance between mother and daughter imploded in spectacular fashion right before my eyes. Blair stopped crying instantly. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She realized the money was gone. The apartment was compromised, and the threat of severe criminal charges was rapidly closing in around her neck. She spun around in her chair and unleashed a vicious, screaming tirade directly at our mother. Blair pointed a shaking finger at Pamela and screamed that this was entirely her fault. She shouted, her voice echoing violently off the glass walls, that Pamela had explicitly promised her I would never fight back. She yelled that Pamela had guaranteed I was far too deeply conditioned to ever destroy the family legally, and that I would simply absorb the financial loss just like I always absorbed everything else. Blair confessed, loudly and clearly in front of the mediator and my attorney, that the entire plan was built on the fundamental assumption that I was a weak, easily manipulated coward. The mediation session completely disintegrated into a chaotic, screaming match between the two of them. The mediator furiously banged his pen against the table, demanding order, but the damage was permanently done. They had turned on each other the exact second the consequences became real. I did not smile. I did not feel a sudden rush of glorious victory. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound exhaustion mixed with a cold, hard satisfaction. I quietly stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and gathered my color-coded binders while they continued to tear each other apart. The mediation had failed to produce a settlement, which was exactly what I wanted. I never intended to settle. I only agreed to this meeting to watch their masks slip and to force them to formally register their panic on the record. The conflict was far from over. The biggest, most devastating knot of the entire ordeal was still tightly secured, waiting to be unleashed. I was saving the absolute final twist for the upcoming courtroom hearing, where I would force these two women to sit in absolute silence and listen to the entire, brutal truth in an environment where they could not manipulate a single soul with their pathetic, manufactured tears. I walked out of the glass room without looking back, leaving them completely alone with the monstrous reality they had built for themselves. The final hearing took place in a stark, heavily wood-paneled courtroom that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The atmosphere was vastly different from the sterile conference room where our initial mediation had spectacularly collapsed. This was not a space for negotiating hurt feelings or airing petty domestic grievances. This was a theater of absolute, uncompromising legal authority. Pamela and Blair sat at the defense table, their previous arrogance completely entirely stripped away, replaced by the hollow, sunken posture of two women facing the terrifying reality of the federal justice system. From the very first moment my attorney addressed the presiding judge, the entire narrative of the case was permanently shifted. Noah Halpern did not present our situation as a messy family disagreement over shared resources. He systematically laid out the facts as a highly coordinated, multi-jurisdictional financial crime. He meticulously detailed the unauthorized digital access, the calculated forgery of electronic authentication, the systematic misappropriation of personal assets, the weaponization of my stolen identity, and the deliberate dissipation of stolen capital across state lines. He painted a picture of a criminal enterprise operating out of a suburban kitchen. The absolute destruction of their defense began with the very first piece of evidence Noah submitted to the court. It was the initial email Pamela had sent to me on the morning of my corporate presentation in Phoenix. My mother had originally typed those words, believing they were a private, untouchable communication within the family, a smug victory lap meant to put me in my place. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom, however, that arrogant message became the ultimate weapon against her. Noah read the words aloud for the official court record. He highlighted how Pamela explicitly admitted to taking the assets and fleeing, effectively handing the judge a signed, written confession of her own premeditated guilt right at the opening bell. Following the email, Noah unleashed a flawless, rapid-fire sequence of undeniable proof. He played the panicked, incriminating voicemail my mother had left for my aunt in Ohio. He submitted the high-definition security camera footage showing the systematic removal of my property. He produced the handwritten inventory list categorizing my belongings for rapid liquidation. He presented the forged Hawaiian lease agreements and the meticulously tracked bank transfer logs. When combined, these separate pieces of evidence interlocked perfectly to form an airtight, impenetrable wall. There was absolutely no room left for denial, no dark corner where they could hide behind the excuse of a simple misunderstanding. As Noah methodically explained the severe criminal penalties associated with cross-state wire fraud and identity theft, the remaining fragile bond between my mother and my sister completely shattered. The prospect of facing actual prison time was the ultimate catalyst. Blair, realizing that she was legally tied to a sinking ship, descended into a state of absolute, unfiltered panic. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and desperately interrupted her own legal counsel. In a frantic, tear-soaked plea to the judge, Blair aggressively shifted the entirety of the blame onto Pamela. She sobbed uncontrollably, stating that she was manipulated into participating. But it was her next sentence that fundamentally altered my understanding of the entire ordeal. Blair confessed, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom, that Pamela had explicitly guaranteed the plan was completely foolproof. Blair swore under oath that our mother had promised them I would never fight back. Pamela had told her that I was trained to choose silence over winning. My mother had assured my sister that I had spent so many years sacrificing my own needs for the sake of family peace that I would simply swallow this massive betrayal to avoid a public scandal. Hearing those words spoken aloud in a court of law was the single most painful revelation of my life. It was a completely devastating psychological twist. Pamela had not merely utilized her status as a mother to gain access to my home and steal my money. She had actively, maliciously gambled her entire criminal enterprise on the deeply cynical belief that my lifelong conditioning would prevent me from ever defending myself. She viewed my historical generosity not as a virtue, but as a fatal weakness to be exploited to the absolute maximum degree. But her gamble failed spectacularly. The judge ruled decisively in my favor, his tone laced with visible disgust for their actions. The final judgment was swift and merciless. Every single remaining asset in Hawaii, including the luxury apartment lease and the fraudulent business accounts, was permanently frozen and ordered to be liquidated to satisfy the judgment. The vast majority of my stolen savings was legally recovered and wired back into my secure trusts. The physical belongings they had not yet managed to fence were ordered to be crated and shipped back to North Carolina at their own expense. For the missing capital and the irreplaceable items they had already sold, the court imposed a crushing, long-term financial restitution schedule. They were legally bound to garnish their own future wages to repay me, and the court order included incredibly severe default clauses. If they missed a single monthly payment, the civil judgment would immediately escalate, triggering aggressive asset seizures and potential criminal contempt charges. They were entirely trapped by the very legal system they thought they could outrun. I did not get every single thing back. A few precious family keepsakes were lost to the estate liquidators forever, vanishing into the secondary market. The fundamental trust I once held for my own blood relatives was entirely destroyed, and there is no insurance company on the planet that underwrites the loss of a mother and a sister. But I gained something far more valuable than the money sitting in my bank account. I definitively reclaimed the ultimate right to define my own personal value. I proved to them, and more importantly to myself, that I was no longer the silent, suffering provider. Several months after the final gavel fell, I utilized a significant portion of the recovered funds to formally purchase a majority equity stake in my own newly formed consulting firm. I named it Carter Trace Advisory. I decided to physically manifest this new chapter of my life within the very walls of the home they had tried to violate. I hired a crew of contractors to completely gut the second guest bedroom, the exact room my sister Blair had occupied for years. They tore up the carpet, repainted the walls a crisp, professional white, and installed heavy, reinforced steel filing cabinets and a massive executive desk. I transformed the space from a parasite's bedroom into my own private, impenetrable corporate command center. It was my way of completely rewriting the internal map of my own house using my newly established power. Late one evening, as I was sitting at my new desk reviewing a highly lucrative corporate contract, a single email arrived in my private inbox. The sender was Pamela. The subject line was blank. I opened the message. The tone of the email was incredibly weak, pathetic, and dripping with a desperate, lingering hope that she could still manipulate my emotions. She wrote a rambling paragraph about how difficult her life had become, how much she missed the way things used to be, and ended by asking if there was any possible way for our family to find a path back to each other. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the glowing white screen for a very long time. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no guilt. I leaned forward, placed my fingers on the keyboard, and typed a single, definitive sentence to permanently close the book on our shared history. You did not lose me when you took the money. You lost me when you assumed I would let you keep it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from down in the comments section so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.